So good morning, I think good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from Africa, and welcome to our AESATA webinar series that is being organized by the Association of Eastern and Southern Africa Travel Agents. My name is Nikador Sabula. I wear two hats. My full-time job is being the CEO of the Kenya Association of Travel Agents, but I also do volunteer as the CEO of the Association of Eastern and Southern Africa Travel Agents, AESATA, that is hosted in our office here in Nairobi, Kenya. Now, we began a couple of years just to do this series, webinar series, to be able to speak about travel across Africa under the umbrella of AESATA. If you will allow me, I'll just run you through a quick introductory presentation of what this is all about today, and also introduce our speakers. And I'll do that just shortly. Confirm that you can see my screen.
Yes, we are able to view your screen.
All right. So I just wanted to very quickly introduce you to AESATA, for those that may not be knowing AESATA. AESATA is a regional membership organization for travel agents. Started in 2018, and it brings together travel agents, National Travel Agents Association from 12 countries, which are Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Somalia, Ethiopia, Malawi, Rwanda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mauritius, Angola, and South Africa. The mission of AESATA is really to provide a platform to address cross-border issues that affect travel on the continent, foster collaboration among travel agencies or travel agents in the region. We also do monitor trends in the travel industry. We advocate for a conducive business environment, both in country and also intra country within our region, and generally promote professionalism in the travel and tourism industry. Our vision is to be a catalyst for advancing intra-Africa travel and tourism, both within the region and globally. We have got really 6 objectives. If you look at it, I've mentioned about advocacy. I've mentioned about empowerment. How do we provide resources to boost intra-Africa travel and trade? I've spoken about solidarity. We need to foster unity amongst our members. And that's why so often we do participate in each other's event. And that's very important for us as a travel agency community. There's also, just adaptability. How do we embrace change and innovation within our industry, whether it's technology, whether it's a financial system, and there's a lot of changes that happen within the industry. Of course, we operate with integrity and trust, and our aim is to advance, and drive this industry and grow professionalism within our member associations. Now, so today we wanted to talk about enabling intra-Africa travel, and many of you are in the travel space, and you know that travel across and within Africa remains a challenge, and we have taken upon ourselves the responsibility to see how do we enable intra-Africa travel so that we can find and allow more Africans to travel within the continent. And for travel agents, really, this is also from a selfish point of view, increase more travel within the continent, increase trade within the continent means that we're also able to do more business and trade amongst ourselves. And therefore, we need to start systematically tackling the barriers that hinder intra-Africa travel. And one of the issues that have been identified by experts include the issues with visa accessibility. We are still struggling, to travel across the continent because of the limitations that actually have been imposed by our government around visa, and even when countries make efforts to want to become visa free, there are still hurdles that they put. And a case in example is when Kenya, introduced, and Kenya now regards itself as a visa free country. But nevertheless, they've introduced the travel, what is it called, the ETA. And the ETA has come with its own limitations. So we need to be able to look at those issues. There's been talk around having a unified African passport. I don't know whether that is a route that is giving us a panacea towards Africa travel, but that's something that we will also be discussing today. And therefore, the third element is really the restrictive air travel policies. We've been singing about open sky policies. And if you are in the travel industry, in the aviation industry, far back from the Yamoussoukro agreement that was established almost many decades ago. So we need to be able to strategically identify actionable strategies that will allow us to overcome these obstacles. And that's why, we want to look at open skies, we look at the African passport, we look at possibilities of the Africa trade and tourism, and particularly with the coming into effect of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And we want to see what does that mean for the continent. And then we'll also look at, just how do we go over these barriers on visa accessibility in the continent. So we've got all these 5 objectives. I will not read through them, but ideally we are here to be able to share and learn amongst ourselves. We've allowed some experts to come in and help us look at this. So without really going into much, we have got our 3 speakers. There's Mr. Ramesh Chaitu, who is an international trade and policy consultant at the AFCFTA. And he'll be looking at how do we tackle the barriers to inter-Africa travel. So he'll be the first one to go, and he will just share us around what are some of the barriers, he sees that as an expert towards intra-Africa travel, and what are some of the lessons we can draw from the AFCFTA. And then we're also privileged to have Captain Gilbert Kibe. Gilbert is an expert, in the aviation field. He's a man that I know very well, and he's the MD of Air Transport Consulting Limited, and he will be talking to us about the Single Africa Air Transport Market, SAATM, as you're aware, that has been around. And then my very good friend Otto De Vries, who is Executive Director of the World Travel Agents Association, which is a global, association that brings together travel agencies, associations from across the globe, and also the CEO of the Association of Southern Africa Travel Agents, AESATA, who will just be able to bring in the perspective of the travel agencies in this discussion. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you to this session. I hope that it will be educative, it will be informative, and you'll have a lot of questions, to be able to answer. Having said that, at this point, I now want to ask Ramesh to come and make his presentation. Perhaps, Ramesh, you could introduce yourself and then straight on, get into the discussion for the day. Over to you, Ramesh.
Thanks. However, how do I... will somebody show my slides, or do I have to... show them from my end? Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you at all.
Oh, sorry, I'm saying you can actually do it by yourself, or we can do it for you because we have got the slides.
Okay.
What do you prefer?
But perhaps it's best if you run it, because I hate Teams and I can't figure out here. I'm not seeing enough to be able to do this quickly.
All right. I'll do that for you then, no worries. I'll be able to do that for you. There we go. Just tell me when you see the presentation.
Yeah, I see it now. So if you can just put it in view mode. Yeah.
There you go.
Good morning, folks. I won't take, this is a 1 hour webinar, so I won't be long. So I'll skip introductions and all that stuff. Suffice it to say that I'm working on developing a regional continental framework for tourism, regulatory framework for tourism with some colleagues across the continent. And this is coming from the CFTA. For those of you who are not familiar with the terminology and the acronyms, it's the African Continental Free Trade Area negotiations, in which they have started by working in 5 service sectors, one of which is tourism, the others are financial services, transport, and business services. On the tourism front, the main thrust is to increase intra-African tourism. And one of the perceived problems is that differences between regulations across African countries may be one of the primary problems. So we're looking to see what is needed to grow trade and investment in tourism services, and in particular, what specific government measures or policies are causing you, the business community, pain. In other words, what is constraining development of intra-African tourism investment? And the reason behind the notion of a continental framework is to see if one can develop a continental framework on tourism that will address the issues that now bother your business, whether they're investment restrictions, whether they're restrictions on or requirements regarding the kind of qualifications you should have, whether they whatever in the government domain. And what we would like to do in turn is hear from the business community in terms of what you see as things that should be done or should not be done in order to improve the business environment. Next slide. Okay, keep going. All right. For the purposes of trade liberalization and trade agreements, tourism is conceptualized in these 4 subsectors or sectors, as some people call them. Hotels and restaurants, well, you all know what that is, but it includes catering, travel agencies and tour operator, tourist guides, and other. Under that grouping, you can put anything there as long as you think it is related to tourism. So when a government is opening its market to foreign competition in this sector, to any other African government in the AFTA context, this is how it schedules, to use a technical term, how it makes its commitment. And you can pick and choose between these different categories. However, as we all know, in the real world, tourism is a very broad and diverse set of economic activities. So the trade sort of construct is a little bit artificial. But that is what we work with in an event, and this is how most governments have tended to liberalize. And I should point out that the markets in these areas are the most liberalized of all service industries on the continent, relatively speaking. Next slide. Now, I won't go through them, but these are some of what could be considered tourism-related services. Next slide. Everybody will get the PowerPoints afterwards. But now what is more interesting to us is the services that are linked to tourism. And here we see everything from transport to construction, because they feed into each other. So when we talk about tourism, or if you talk about tour operator services, you may have a limited sort of interest, but it feeds perhaps more into the economy than any other sector. So that is why getting things right in this area is important in order to promote intra-African tourism. Next slide. Okay, for the purposes of the Continental Free Trade Area negotiations and the agreement that has been signed so far, tourism is traded in 4 different ways: cross-border, and the most classic and the most obvious nowadays is when you sell tour packages online to tourists from another country. but the most common investment still, as far as in the hotel sector is concerned, is in physical investment when you set up businesses in another African country. However, this is a lumpy kind of in terms of capital, and as a result, there is very little intra-African investment in tourism as far as the hotel sector is concerned. In fact, I just got some data from the Economist Intelligence Unit, and they tracked from 2003 to 2023, 418 investment projects from non-African sources into African countries, compared to only 64 intra-African projects in the same period. So investment in intra-African tourism is quite low compared to foreign tourism or foreign direct investment into African countries now. Perhaps that's something that you all may want to consider at another venue or on another occasion. The other area, and this is the problematic part, because it was already mentioned that visas, etc., tend to restrict the movement of African tourists. The other means of trading is when you cross over on a temporary basis into another country, neighboring or otherwise. When you enter to go with your tour group, or a bus driver who crosses a border with a bunch of tourists for short periods. Now, because this is affected by immigration rules and so on, this is perhaps one of the most problematic areas. And the last means for the purposes of trade negotiations is when tourists travel themselves abroad to other destinations in order to consume tourism services. Next slide. One of the reasons regarding tourism and why the African economy is performing poorly is reflected in the Tourism Competitiveness Index, which is compiled by the World Economic Forum and the UNWTO, the tourism organization. And if we here have an extract of where African countries sit out of this 140 countries, and you see apart from Mauritius, South Africa, and the Seychelles, every other African country fares quite low by the standards, but at least by the criteria that are used to rate the competitiveness of your tourism sector. This is something that countries individually and perhaps collectively in region should start paying some attention to. Next slide. I won't go through it now, but they use four criteria to rate countries in terms of the tourism competitiveness. The first is the enabling environment, which is the hassles and how efficient it is, or how hassle-free it is to do business in the sector, safety and security, health and hygiene, etc. The other category is policy and enabling conditions for tourism, and then infrastructure. And here is where there's still a huge problem in many countries. And then the natural and cultural resources, which are quite significant in the 54 odd countries on the continent. But with the 1.3 billion people, the African continent is underperforming. Next slide, which we'll see now in some of the data. Okay, how does Africa as a continent perform vis-a-vis the rest of the world in terms of tourism? Well, in 2016, which is the last period for which we have accurate data, intra-African arrivals stood at only 500,000, or about 9.2% of all international arrivals on the continent. So if we use this as a benchmark, intra-African tourism is quite low. And also in 2016, the tourism on the continent accounted for only 5.1% share in worldwide tourism arrival and 3% share in tourism revenues. So 5.1% in arrivals and only 3% share in tourism revenues. So definitely there is room for significant improvement. And in 2021, but of course this is still within pandemic, there were only 19 million tourists. So things are still far from recovered after this terrible COVID-19 issue. But the important thing to point out is that only 3 countries, South Africa, Morocco, and Tanzania, and perhaps a handful of about 10 countries, make up the vast majority of the tourism receipts on the continent. So there's significant room for improvement across the board. Next slide. However, the future looks good. The predictions are that things should be, by the end of this year, all countries should at least be back to pre-COVID levels. And the question is, how then do you, as a region or as a particular country, how do you cater to bringing back more tourists and increasing your tourism revenues? Next slide. Now, if we look here at this little graphic, you see that Africa's tourism share out of global tourism market is small and it is declining. It seems to have peaked in 2010 or thereabouts and has been going downhill since. That means countries and continentally, the people in the industry have to figure out how to address this particular challenge. Next slide. Well, I won't go through them here, but you see the share of regional versus national for top global tourism destinations. And here, globally, France sets the standards in terms of how many tourists go to France from the region. The United States as well, but even China in 2019 had 63 million visitors, the vast majority of which came from the Asia-Pacific region, whilst that is not the case in the African continent. Next slide. If you look at travel exports, and this is what I mentioned, Egypt, of course, is huge and has tremendous historical resources, and that is the biggest draw. Morocco has a lot of beach and, again, cultural and ancient sites, etc. South Africa comes next because of mainly a combination of wildlife tourism and beach and other recreational things. And if you go down, you see Little Mauritius, which is a tiny island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, still performs quite significantly given how small and limited is it in terms of population and everything else. It does say that something, the Mauritians are doing something right, and perhaps this is, so there are some examples there to be examined. Next slide. Now, what are the greatest constraints to intra-African tourism? We all know the problems of visas. There are 35 African countries that require visas of all other African countries. The next is poor connectivity. Gilbert will talk about that. But we also want to know what are the other barriers that are due to government regulations that should be addressed, apart from the 2 tricky ones, which is visas and so on, which is highly politically sensitive these days. What other things on the licensing side, on the regulations governing investment or whatever, that you think one should pay attention to? Next slide. From the trade perspective, we put it in this context. Restrictions on cross-border trade, restrictions on investment, restrictions on the movement of business persons or service suppliers, however you want to call them, and restrictions on the entry of tourists. Okay, and what you need to do as the industry is try to lobby your governments to work on removing and reducing these 4 different areas of investments. Okay, even on these 4 areas of restrictions, and even on investment, there are a lot of nationalistic type rules in many countries that tend to put a damper on intra-African investment in tourism and everywhere else. These are horizontal type restrictions. Next slide. There are 2 fundamental rules in the African Continental Free Trade Area agreement that have implications, positive implications for all tourism operators. The first is national treatment. Simply put, this says that when a government lets a foreign service supplier in, he must treat that entity or that person no less favorable than its own suppliers. Okay? Now, it's important that this is an absolute principle, but some countries have restrictions and limitations on that. It's important for you to pay attention to how you're treated in the market in which you're looking to do business, and try to lobby for reduction of restrictions that give you less than equivalent treatment to domestic suppliers. Next slide. Now, in that regard, what are some of the regulatory issues regarding travel agency and tour operators? Well, nowadays, the first one is that, and this is because the laws and the regulations are a bit old on the books. Many countries say that you cannot supply travel agency or tour operator services through cross-border means electronically. In other words, you have to go and establish physically in the countries where you want to do business. Okay. Now, this seems a little bit nonsensical, given the fact that most people book holidays on global platforms that originate in large, rich, developed countries. But still, nevertheless, several African governments still require that you physically establish, and this is a constraint for travel agency and tour operators. Then there's also nationality or citizenship requirement. Some countries say that in order to do this business, you must be a national. That means you could meet nationality requirements, either if you live there a long period of time. But what is even worse is that if they say only citizens can do that, then that affects your ability to do travel agency to operate a business in neighboring countries. Then there are ownership limits in terms of investment. Some countries require joint venture stipulations that you must find a local partner. And perhaps the most nefarious and most vague, because then governments can do whatever they want, is that when they say that you must prove that there's an economic need for your business in the particular market in which you're looking to set up, or in which you're looking to do either cross-border trade or whatever. Next slide. And I think I'll stop here. The question then is, what works in different Can you go back up a bit? Do you have examples in specific tourism activities in the case of tour operators and travel agencies of regional standards or rules or regulations that work well that you think you'd like to recommend for the overall African context in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Area? Thank you very much. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for that very quick run, in terms of barriers. And I think I'll be coming back to you, Shaito, because I've got a couple of questions. But I thought maybe before we proceed, I want to bring in our next speaker, and that's Captain Gilbert Kibe, and he'll be talking about SAATM, because one of the biggest challenges we have on the continent, and we all know because we're in travel and we experience this, is a whole issue about air connectivity. And there are some efforts that are being done, I know at the Africa Union level, some efforts being done at the AESATA level, but perhaps Gilbert, you could come in and share with us, how far have we've been talking for far too long about opening our skies. Why are we not making progress? What is holding us back? Are we on course? Shall we ever see an Africa that traveling across the borders becomes a bit easier than it is now? So Gilbert, over to you. I don't know whether you again want to run the slides from your end. You're free to do that. If you need help, then let us. Okay, there you go.
Thank you very much, Nick. I hope you can see the screen.
Yeah, maybe put it on the view mode again so that we can see it.
I put it on presentation mode. Can you see that?
Presentation mode. It's on presentation mode? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. And good morning or good afternoon, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to come and talk to you about the subject that Nick has just explained. So I will be talking as the ambassador of the SAATM, the Single Africa Air Transport Market, which is an AU program. And I am the ambassador for the eastern region of 14 eastern states. So the Africa Civil Aviation Commission is the aviation body it's a specialized agency of the African Union on all civil aviation matters in Africa, with its headquarters in Dakar, Senegal. And we are the executing agency of the Yamoussoukro decision. You'll recall there was a Yamoussoukro declaration in 1988, which was 36 years ago, where African heads of state and government declared that Africa will become liberalized and there'll be free movement of persons, etc. So in 1999, that declaration became a decision that the Single Africa Air Transport Market should be formed. And it was actually formed in 2018, finally. So the AFCAC was, being the aviation body for the African Union, was charged with the responsibility of implementing SAATM. So the vision of AFCAC is to foster a safe, secure, efficient, cost-effective, sustainable, and environmentally friendly civil aviation industry in African states. The mission is to facilitate cooperation and coordination among African states towards the development of integrated and sustainable air transport systems and foster the implementation of ICAO standards and recommended practices, or SAPs. We also have values, good governance, best practices, transparency, accountability, professionalism and integrity, impartiality, in the same as AESATA. So the strategic priorities of AFCAC are many: aviation safety, human resource development, environmental protection, aviation security, air transport, and all those other priorities that you see in between. And today I'll only concentrate on the left, which is SAATM, YD, and PIP implementation. We start with the African Union. It has 16 flagship projects under Agenda 2063, the Africa that we want. And what we shall concentrate on today, and it has already been spoken to by Ramesh and also mentioned by Nick, is the AFCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. FMP is the free movement of persons and the African passport, an extremely important project. And Ramesh has already spoken about the challenges of the visa regime and SAATM itself, Single Africa Air Transport Market. Now, I need to explain, first of all, where Africa is in aviation. 43 million passengers. We're only 2.1% of the global aviation industry. And African carriers, their share is only 20%. 80% is foreign airlines, Emirates, Qatar, Air France, KLM, British Airways, you name it. 61% passenger load factor average, 47% cargo load factor, only 7.7 million jobs supported, and a 63 billion contribution to the African GDP. This is the global map of movement of aircraft around the world. Look at the North America. Look at Europe. Look at the Middle East and the Far East. You can see the huge traffic that is plying all those routes in those areas. Look at Australia, and then look at Latin America, South America. But look at Africa. It's almost dark. Air traffic in Africa is only 2% of global traffic. Something needs to be done about that. And yet, we are the largest continent. You will know that the size of Africa translates to all of the United States, all of Europe, all of China, all of India, and all of Japan. All those can fit into Africa. The size of Africa is huge. It's 30.4 million square kilometers. And yet, only 2% of air traffic. Now, accessibility of air transport in Africa. So we have the 5 regions of Africa under AFCAC. We have the northern region, which has 7 states, but only 2 of them have signed up for implementation of SAATM. West Africa, of the 16 states, 15 have already signed up for implementation of SAATM, which is 94%. In Central Africa, 9 states, all 9 states have joined. In Southern Africa, there are 5 states and all 5 states have joined. In Eastern side, there's 18 states, of which 6 have joined. And that is their distribution, as you can see. Now, Africa came up with this SAATM pilot implementation project. Now, it was launched under the theme of the acceleration of air transport liberalization in Africa to improve continental connectivity and integration. Goal number 1 is to increase Fifth Freedom traffic rights across Africa from 14.5% to 30%. Goal number 2 is to increase intersectoral collaboration and synergies between air transport institutions and other sectors of the economy. I need to explain what Fifth Freedom traffic rights means. So ICAO came up with 9 freedoms of the air or traffic rights. So first, second, third, and fourth freedoms allow airlines to operate from country A to country B and back to country A, where you started. But a fifth freedom traffic right allows an airline from country A to fly with passengers and cargo to country B, drop and also pick passengers and cargo from country B and fly to country C. So that would be a third country, and then back again. So we want to increase fifth freedom traffic rights from 14.5% to 30% by 2025, and that is next year. So what is the importance of fifth freedom? You will find that if an airline in country B does not operate to country C, but an airline from country A is willing to operate from country A to country B and then on to C, that fifth freedom is important and is useful because the country B also benefits from movement of people and services from country B to country C, because the airline from country A will get into an agreement with the airline or the state in country B, where that country B state will get a share of the revenues from B to C. It's a very, very useful freedom to have. Now, the continental benefits of SAATM implementation over the next 1 or 2 years, there'll be an additional 588,000 jobs created, an additional 4.2 billion additional contribution to the GDP. And this will happen by fare reduction. So fares will reduce by 26%, resulting in a fare saving of 1.4 billion per annum. Consumer surplus will increase by $2.85 billion. Traffic growth, an additional 15.9 million additional passengers will fly, which will be a 31% increase. 6.7 million passengers increase in the 35 SAATM states, representing a 37% growth. Connectivity, we expect an additional 145 city pairs. A city pair is a non-stop flight from country A to country B, direct services, without having to pass through another country. So there are many, there's only very few examples of city pairs in Africa, and we need to increase city pair connectivity. Job creation, an additional nearly 100,000 jobs will be created in aviation, 268,000 plus new jobs in tourism, an additional 4 million tourists will come into Africa, and a 1.1% increase in trade within the continent. Now, there are impediments to SAATM. One of them is a culture of non-prioritization of aviation in Africa. which is very sad. African governments have not understood the benefits of air transport. Number two, there's a policy of protectionism. Many states with airlines are protecting their own airlines, believing that if you allow fifth freedom traffic into their country, that their own airline will suffer. But that is not really the case, because when you're under SAATM, when you're operating under SAATM, you will have terms and conditions of how fifth freedom can operate. One of those terms and conditions is for the dominant carrier who's coming from somewhere else should have an agreement with your state airline in which you enter into, engage into an interline agreement, a code share agreement, a revenue share agreement, etc. So the policy of protectionism should end when that happens. Another impediment is an unfavorable regulatory environment where freedom traffic rights are not easily attainable or granted to airlines. There's a low level of YD compliant air service agreements. There aren't enough air service agreements between states that allow fifth freedom and beyond traffic rights. Another impediment is the high operational cost. Ladies and gentlemen, taxes, fees, and charges are one of the highest costs in air transport. In many, many cases, you will find that your ticket price, about 65% of that ticket cost is government taxes, fees, and charges, and other costs, which is a huge impediment to SAATM. There's also inadequate airport infrastructure in many of the airports in Africa, and an undercapitalization of African airlines, and they are struggling. We also have a low level of effective implementation of ICAO standards and recommended practices, which is an impediment to SAATM. So on this slide, we see the non-physical barriers are reciprocity is not there, non-harmonization of applications and costs. Approvals of carrier designations are an issue, high inspection costs, lack of consistency, visa and cargo facilitation issues, which is what has also been mentioned. So this is what AFCAC is doing for the implementation of SAATM. We're advocating for all African Union states to join and implement SAATM. We want to promote the reduction of air transport taxes, fees, and charges on African aviation, promoting new intra-Africa routes traffic and secondary gateway development. We want to enhance intra-Africa fifth freedom passenger flights. We want to promote the alignment of all air service agreements between the SAATM states to fully comply with the provisions of the YD. We also want supporting states in the domestication and harmonization of the Yamoussoukro Declaration legal instruments, such as consumer protection and competition laws. And we also want to promote and enhance economic oversight capabilities of member states. But let me explain something about SAATM, what it means in simple terms. We want African airlines to fly within Africa as if they are domestic flights and not international. So what does that mean? I've mentioned that taxes, fees, and charges. When you domesticate your taxes, fees, and charges, you will find that air passenger service charge, which is a part of your ticket cost, currently is $50 in some states, each way you go. So if you domesticate the air passenger service charge from $50, it will come down to $5. That's a 90% reduction in that tax. And if you do the same with all the other fees and charges, you're looking at, instead of 65% taxes being your ticket cost, we can bring that down to 10% or less. What does that mean? It means that if you have low-cost carriers operating in Africa, the $50 ticket will arise. The $100 ticket will be possible. When you look at the legacy airlines, the Kenya Airways, South Africa Airways, Egypt, etc., you're looking at ticket prices even coming down to $200 or $300. So an example is Nairobi to Lagos is about $1,000 for economy. But if it became domestic, that ticket could come down to, say, $300. So what would you do with $300? You would be able to travel easily to Lagos. And one thing about Lagos, Africans who watch the TV are addicted to Nollywood movies. So many Africans would want to go to Lagos and visit Nollywood to see this place that produces the movies and TV series that they love. So if the ticket is $300 versus $1,000, you'd be able to go with your partner, two of you for $600. You'll be able to stay for a weekend there and spend $300 in accommodation, transport, etc. And you'll even have some change to buy some souvenirs. And if you have a bit of extra money, you might find something that is interesting for you to buy in Nigeria that you could either give to people at home, or you could even find a market that can sell that produce. So what you have done, you have increased tourism in Africa by implementing SAATM. You have also increased trade because you are going to buy things for trading purposes. So that is the importance of SAATM in a nutshell. So let's conclude. How are we going to implement this? The industry, we need to have airline cooperation and collaboration so that competing airlines can work together and allow additional freedom traffic rights, and new city pairs will be created. We need to look for new business models, innovation, financing, and investment in industry. For governments, we need to tackle the culture of non-prioritization of aviation. States need to join and implement SAATM. We need to eliminate protectionism of all the airlines in Africa. We need to reduce taxes, fees, and charges on aviation. And we need to improve the aviation infrastructure and its operating environment. So the benefits will be long-term development goals for the airline, for the continent. There will be greater affordability, convenience, and choice for consumers. New routes and opportunities will come up for African carriers, resulting in socio-economic development in the Africa continent. And so, ladies and gentlemen, when SAATM is implemented, Africa will become prosperous and the people will be happy. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much, Gilbert, for such an insightful presentation. I've got lots of questions. I've been picking notes, and I can't wait to shoot some of those questions to you. And so is our participants. Just keep your questions ready. By the way, if you can, put some of them in the chat so that as we continue with the conversation, we can be tackling those ones. So if you have any question for Gilbert, put it on the chat. If you have any question for Chaitu, so far, put it on the chat. If you have any other question that you think we may need to discuss here, I want to invite you to put it on the chat. So before I come back and grill a little bit more information from the two presenters, I wanted to introduce our third speaker this morning, and that is Otto De Vries. Otto is a seasoned, travel agent association, manager, and he's been in this space. I meet with him a lot in international forums, speaking about, travel, Africa, but also global travel. Of course, he leads the one of the world's, leading travel agents association, a leading travel agency association here in Africa. That is South Africa. That's a big market. And I'm wondering, Otto, just in terms of making your opening remarks, you've listened to these two gentlemen, and what has rattled me is that our air traffic is just about 2%. And, we make our living as travel agents, a lot from air travel. So if what we are making is a paltry 2% of, was a global, what do you make of these two presentations, wearing your travel agent's hats?
Yeah, sure, Nick. Good morning from Cape Town, and it's great to be with you. First of all, to my colleagues, Ramesh and Gilbert, thank you very much for those very insightful presentations. I think it's very important that we understand the space that we are in order to try and address what those challenges look like. And I think the role of the associations becomes quite clear. And it's also incumbent that we collaborate and work collectively with all the stakeholders across the value chain who represent all of the parties that are impacted by what is clearly dated and cumbersome, complex, and economic destroying policies. And when the facts are on the table, it is very evident that, what we're dealing with is a lack of urgency and a lack of intent, and possibly even a lack of understanding of the value of the broader travel and tourism industry from an economic benefit point of view. And I think that, this is where the advocacy work of all of us come into this space. The more research, the more data, and the more access to information that we can share with the decision makers and find ways to ensure that there's a broader level of collaboration across countries, because I think the work starts on a national level and then expands to regional and continental. But these discussions have been going on for an extremely long time, and I think that the pace of the developments have left a lot to be desired. In terms of what that means for us as travel agents and those of us that are selling travel, look, I think we have to acknowledge that the work of travel agents extends well beyond the sale of airline tickets, but it is a pivotal component in terms of ensuring that we're able to move people from point A to point B in an effective manner that is both price conscious but also time conscious. So we cannot underestimate the importance of the aviation component. And to Captain Gilbert's comments, I mean, if we just think about the size of this continent, the only way that we are going to genuinely open up trade and tourism is by advocating and growing the aviation sector and making sure that the markets are open and liberalized, and that we allow these airlines to operate across multiple markets and destinations. I don't think that the fifth freedom has been better written for anybody else than for the continent of Africa. But we only have to look at the liberalized airspace in Europe to have a case study where we can understand exactly what that success can look like. So, we have a role to play as an industry. But I think at the same time, we are astute enough to carve out a successful business operation and a successful industry that extends well beyond just the component of selling air. But we cannot underestimate how important it is that we participate in this process going forward.
Great. So those are great opening remarks. And perhaps, gentlemen, we can have just a quick conversation around some of the issues that have arisen just from this. And also, I am picking some of the questions on the chat. Yes, I was coming to you, Gilbert. I know you've been a regulator. In air matters here in Kenya, but also, spoken to your colleagues. What you've presented seems to be an easy thing. Open up the continent, increase travel, increase trade. We all make money. We grow our economies. When you sat in some of these government offices, what did you find as a challenge? In terms of just opening up our sky, enabling trade, and what are some of the practical things that we now as a private sector associations can do to push our governments to see perhaps what you now see, and what is it that government doesn't see, and what is it so difficult for governments to just agree, with research, with the realities that are here, that if we open up our skies, open up our countries, then you're going to increase intra-Africa trade. It's a shame when you look at that air traffic, and we know that our continent is vast, is well resourced. For me, it looks like common sense. You've sat in those rooms. Perhaps you can give us some of the thinking inside there.
Nick, it's very simple. African governments don't believe that SAATM can work. They don't believe it's true. And the biggest problem that I have noted is that the ministers of finance in Africa do not understand how you should reduce taxes to increase revenue. They have never understood it. And so we go to numerous African states and we try and convince governments that we should implement SAATM for the greater benefit of each state. But we have had a very, very hard time getting a seat on the table. So you'll talk to a minister here, a minister there, they'll say, yes, all this is very good. But then at the end of the day, nothing happens. So they haven't believed that the concept of SAATM can actually work in Africa. And people believe that you're actually going to get less revenue. But that is not true. The way I've described implementation of SAATM by reducing taxes, fees, and charges means that your ticket price will be much cheaper and you'll be able to travel. I gave you the example of how with $1,000, you'll be able to go, two of you, to Lagos to go and see Nollywood. The person or the people who will do that today is, let's say, one. But if that ticket goes from 1,000 to 300, then maybe 1,000 people will go instead of just the one. So that little 10% taxes, fees, and charges will equate to a much higher quantum US dollar revenue if 1,000 people travel than if only one person travels. So we haven't managed to convince governments to look at it that way. And we give examples like Otto is saying. Europe is an excellent example of that. When in 1999, 26 years ago, when the decision was made in Yamoussoukro to liberalize the African skies and become domestic, 5 years later, the EU itself did a sort of a copy-paste of the YD and implemented it in Europe. Now, at that time, there were 9 European Union states. Today, there are 27. Those people operate as domestic to each other. $50 tickets, $100 tickets are everywhere. Airlines have been, low-cost carriers have been established everywhere. In 1993, when the EU liberalized that way, the biggest complainants were the legacy carriers. The Lufthansa's, the Air France, KLM, British Airways, all those guys were really, really pissed off with government, for the EU, for allowing the liberalization of the airspace. But at that time, they had about 100 airplanes each, those airlines. Then EasyJet came, Ryanair came, the $50 ticket emerged in Europe. There was such an exponential growth in air transport in all of EU that you can't believe the extent today. Those legacy carriers of British Airways and Lufthansa now have 250 plus aeroplanes, and those are the legacy guys who complain the most. Ryanair has 350 aeroplanes, another 400 airplanes on order. The same with EasyJet, the same with all the low-cost carriers. What does that mean? Isn't that a benefit of liberalizing your countries? Isn't that the benefit of SAATM? So Africa being much larger than Europe will become much larger in air transport automatically. But our governments have not seen it. Some of the airlines also have not seen it, and they're enforcing protectionism. So at the end of the day, we lose. And then to make it even worse, visa restrictions are incredible. An African requires visas in nearly all African states. Europeans and other people don't require as many visas as we do. And in many cases, they get visas on arrival. And yet, we Africans, we must apply for visas and all this sort of thing. So there's no free movement of persons, which is and it's an African Union project that says we should make movement of people in Africa among Africans easy. Therefore, there should be a visa-free regime. But we haven't done it. I don't know why. I think governments see as if you remove the visa fee that they'll get reduced revenue. But at the end of the day, you're going to get increased revenue by free movement of persons. So we need to get the African governments to actually listen to us. Give us even just a 1-hour presentation so that we can talk to them the way I'm talking to you, so that they can see what the features and benefits of the implementation of SAATM is. So I hope that answers your question. It's a huge challenge for us, but we have such a great opportunity that we won't even believe. Thank you.
Yeah, great. And I'll come back to you, I think, maybe for one last question. But Ramesh, I thought, and help me, the language that government seems to understand and they listen to very easily is a language of trade, and you tend to feel like when you show them trade, then it's travel is going to follow. And perhaps that's why the AFCFTA has come in, to perhaps entice them, that let's trade amongst ourselves. And then after we start trading, and then travel will follow. But I find it a chicken egg situation. Do you trade first and then travel, or do you travel first and then trade? What is the nexus between the two? And what opportunities are you seeing with the AFCFTA? Are we making progress? Since the AFCFTA came into being, do you think that we are beginning to shift, and what extent is a shift? And do you see that, what sort of like time frame would you provide perhaps before the AFCFTA becomes a reality, and we see an increased volume of trade amongst our continent, in our continent? You're on mute.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very complex question that needs a long and big answer, but I'll try to perhaps be a little bit strategic on it. To respond to your question as your observation that perhaps they see more benefit in trading rather than travel and tourism, that related stuff. I'm not sure that's the case. I think African governments make decisions based on trends and trends and what is cool or what is considered important at a particular point in time. So the AFCFTA is getting a lot of attention because the African Union has managed to convince heads of state that, look, this is an African project that we should all work on. Now, and by and large, they're doing that, but there are many countries who are not really plugged into that. They're pretending that they're there, but they're not really doing it. They have other priorities: poverty alleviation, conflict, etc., etc. But what it does demonstrate is that when you can convince the African Union to put you on the agenda, perhaps that is the segue to get access to the behavior or the policy making guys at the continental level, in other words, presidents. So what I would suggest is perhaps it's time that the tourism industry started to lobby nationally, regionally, and continentally to say, hey guys, if you want to drive African growth and integration, tourism is the best way to do it. Because tourism has the largest multiplier effects into the economy. For years, people used to say construction, but that is a fallacy. When you look, that's why one of my slides, I had a listing of the things that feed into tourism. When the tourism sector is booming, everything else grows, everything, including, things that are not so positive as well. So because tourism is the big multiplier effect, I think you all need to start to send signals nationally to your governments and to your finance ministers. It's not the trade ministers that have power in government, sir. Presidents listen to finance ministers, and that is where you have to make your play, not trade ministers. I don't know any country on the continent where the trade minister is powerful. But the finance ministers, they call the shots. So if I were you, strategically, I would start making the case to your ministries of finance of the role that tourism plays in your overall economic sort of growth and development and employment. When you look at all the service sectors on the continent and elsewhere in the world as well, the largest employer of youth and women is tourism activities. And nobody is saying that. The African continent also has the largest segment of young people in the world. And jobs, as the Singaporeans say, all policy should be about jobs. If you apply that methodology to the African continent, this is where the investment should be. This is what they should stimulate. It should not be an issue to have to wonder whether or not, you should have open skies and that there should be a single African market and all that stuff. This should be reality on the ground, but somebody needs to make the case to finance ministers so they can sell it to their presidents, because they're the ones who call the shots. I mean, that is what I would tell you as an outsider observer looking on at this.
Completely agree with you, Ramesh. And maybe just to keep that conversation going, I think it's certainly been an intentional target of associations in South Africa to encourage the model of job creation and the importance. And without having to say anything more than you've already highlighted very succinctly, it is a process that we have certainly adopted. But I take on board that the decision making has to shift. I guess from country to country, policymakers think and operate slightly differently, but I do fully agree with you that it's incumbent that those strategies shift to, where there's the most likely ability to have impact. And I think really when we think about strategically approaching this, whilst we can use Europe as an example, it would also be important for us to use African examples of success. I think there's a story to be told with regards to policy advocacy in terms of what the South African tourism industry is doing in that regard, and the principles around job creation and the opportunities that it generates as a multiplier effect. But I think we can also take a feather out of the cap from Rwanda, who just by, for example, introducing visas on arrival, were able to increase their tourism by 24% from other African countries. So this attributed to ease of entry, and it obviously reduced bureaucratic hurdles for visitors. It boosted obviously trade and investment. And there was, for example, a massive increase of 50% in trade with neighboring countries for Rwanda alone. So, this is where we start to get this multiplier effect of what starts to happen. So maybe a combination of two parts. The one part is the complex policy issues around visa regimes, open skies. But I think parallel to that is to also manage to succinctly share a good news story around the opportunity with job creation and the multiplier effect that has.
Nick,
I mean, absolutely.
Sorry, Nick.
Yes,
I
go ahead.
too, I totally agree with Ramesh and Otto and what they have said. The tourism is a huge enabler. So I have a concept that I call Pan-African travel for tourism and trade. So travel is air transport. Tourism is what is being described here, and trade is also what we're trying to describe here. And that's why in my presentation I had those three flagship projects: AFCFTA, free movement of persons, and SAATM. So when you enable these programs to operate, the free movement of persons takes care of the visa regime. In the East African community, we have an example of Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda, where you don't even need a passport to travel. We travel between the three countries using our national ID cards. In Europe, free movement of persons means there's no visas for the 27 European Union states. So there's free movement of persons. Now, when you stimulate tourism, those tourists also create trade opportunities. I gave an example. If you fly to Nollywood, you go and buy things in Nigeria that you could sell in Kenya. You've created trade. So tourism does create trade opportunities. for countries around the world. So I agree with these gentlemen that tourism is one of the easiest but most important and critical enabler of trade across all states, Africa included.
Especially business travel, right? I mean, we talk about trade, but trade extends across so many different components. When we speak about tourism, we really tend to have quite a narrow thought about what tourism looks like. When the fact of the matter is that business tourism is a massive contributor to job creation and a massive contributor to economic development and growth. And as we see multinationals expanding their footprints, the need for business people to be able to move seamlessly between countries in which they operate is critical for the success of those business investments and for them to be able to grow those businesses as well. So, I see this as potentially, really a three-pronged approach, and making sure that, we can make a clear case where they all speak to each other in terms of what the ultimate opportunities would look like.
Great. I'm going to come back. Ramesh?
No, but just, let me just put a little plug in here, because I didn't say it, but I put it in my PowerPoint slide, that the biggest growth segment in tourism on the African continent is business travelers. Okay. In fact, the rest of it is basically what you call in the industry VFRs, visiting friends and relatives. I flew to Ghana from Brussels last Saturday. The plane was 100% full. I mean, full. Everything was full. The front, the middle, and the back of the plane. And 80% of it were Ghanaians returning to Ghana for something, and with their friends, one or two young people with friends and so on. That's the main intra-African tourism segment, even in the southern region, even in the eastern region. But the growth in business tourism and MICE, which is meetings and conventions and so on, is great. However, most of the tour operators, etc., are totally oblivious of finding a strategy to take these business visitors and make them increase their spend locally. Okay? And that is a thing that I've asked every capital city I go to. There is nothing for me that I can do in half a day. Nothing. All the tourism programming on African cities and African countries are for people who go there to hang out as tourists of a leisure type. But if you look at the millions who are traveling as business travelers, who are there with maybe a half-day downtime, there's not a single product for them. And I'll tell you quickly, I've been to Gaborone many, many, many times over the last 15 years. And every time I wanted to go and climb the hill in the distance, I forgot the name of it. And every time I asked, nobody could tell me how I can get there. They say it's security, da, 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 da. One day, a taxi brought me back to the hotel. And I said, tell me something, what are you doing tomorrow morning at 6? So he looked surprised. I said, I want to go down and climb that hill down there. He said, sure, I'll come for you 5:30 if you want. And I went on my own and hiked up this hill. It was a wonderful thing. I took a bunch of pictures, sent to my friends around the world. And they asked me, well, where is this? They had not a clue. But I see the same thing everywhere. Even if I go to Nairobi, there's no tour operator catering to the business traveler who has half a day potentially on his hands. But if business travelers are the biggest growth segment, you have to start to make products for them, no? For the business traveler tourism experience. And that would be my pitch to your particular segment of the industry, which is the tour operators and travel agents.
Great. And that there is a business opportunity for any travel agent that is here. There's growth, significant growth in the MICE space, business travel. But are we creating opportunities for travelers, to be able to bring business? Now, I'll come to you, gentlemen, just as we wind up. And sorry, our time has run out, but this has just been very exciting to talk about the African passport, which, in my opinion, looks like is a far-fetched. I don't know whether we will achieve this if you're struggling with visas, whether an African passport would be a possibility. So I'll be coming back to your thoughts. But I wanted to check if in the audience is anybody that wants to unmute and make a contribution, just to get to hear what some of our participants, and thank you, you've turned out in huge numbers. Anyone that has anything they want to say, kindly unmute, and I'll give you a minute or two for you to be able to make a comment or ask a question.
Yeah, I also see a question. Yeah, I also see a question in the chat, which I'll be happy to answer when you allow.
Okay. Anybody who has a question or a contribution they want to make? I will allow you. Okay. Great. Do you want to take that question, Gilbert? Because I think it's directed to you. How does SAATM address the challenges of air traffic management and infrastructure development across different member states? And what technological innovations are being implemented to ensure seamless integration and interoperability among diverse aviation systems?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very nice question. With SAATM implementation, we expect the growth and development of air transport. That means air traffic will increase exponentially, which means that the states in which you are flying over will get additional traffic, and it will present challenges when that traffic becomes overwhelming. And I'm talking about air traffic management now. Air traffic controllers, the guy who will say you're clear for takeoff, you're clear to land, you can climb to 30,000 feet, 40,000 feet. So when there's increased traffic, they will require modern equipment to be able to handle that increased traffic. But one of the basic things that they do first is they redesign the airspace of their country, and they create additional capacity. For instance, an air route is like a highway. So when you have a lot of traffic between states, you can double the number of highways going to the same place. So you're creating like a dual carriageway in the sky. So aircraft going east to west use this lane. Aircraft going from west to east use the other lane. Automatically, you double the traffic that you can operate in that airspace. You design new airspace routes using performance-based navigation systems. Those are the technological advancements that needs to do. You design new routes using the GPS systems, global navigation satellite systems is what we call it. And we make sure that they are interoperable with your neighbor next door. Now, with increased traffic means that you will get increased revenue in a particular state, and that revenue goes to the air navigation service provider. So with increased revenue, you'll be able to afford new equipment that will be able to help you to cope with the additional traffic that you get over your airspace. So technology is being implemented for improving the flow of traffic. And so you'll find that in many airspaces around Africa, they've doubled the capacity of what they can handle. We're just waiting for implementation now to take off, and you'll see exponential growth and development of air transport in Africa.
Thank you very much. I'll come back now to you so that we round out, and remember everybody has a question on their thoughts on the African passport. But Otto, as you wind down and give your final comments, there's clearly need for us as travel agents associations from our countries to collaborate and work together, right from Botswana, South Africa, all the way to Malawi, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and even Somalia. What do you think will be our role in this, and how do we begin to craft a common agenda that then pushes this intra-Africa travel? Speak to that, and then speak to the African passport.
Sure. Look, I think first and foremost, we built the structures in terms of associations like AESATA and others. And I think the active participation of the national associations in this broader forum is critical to ensuring that we have the success. So it's about making sure that we have a clear mandate from all of our members within this regional association to pursue a combined strategy. I think high level, we've covered off quite clearly, I think, an intent around potentially 3 pillars. But what we may need to do is have a more strategic session where we can collectively make sure that what we're discussing has impact on a national level as well as on a regional level for all of the members. So I think we need to take this conversation further, Nick, and I think we need to see, on what way we are able to formulate a meaningful strategy that can be implemented on national as well as on a regional level, and making sure that we're able to engage the relevant stakeholders and speak to the right people who are going to help to support some of the intent that we would have from an advocacy point of view. It'll be a long journey, and I guess that takes me to the next topic which you wanted me just to touch on, which is this idea of an African passport. I think at its core, until we find a way to create a meaningful African Union that is not a talk shop, but is actually a meaningful, structured organization that starts to speak on a continental level around continental issues, whilst we are still trying to deal with national strategies and national policies that are hindering the opportunity for the kind of developments that we need. We spoke today in some detail with regards to the challenges and the restrictions that we're seeing in terms of protectionism, in terms of lack of development and progress, in terms of seeing things like taxes as being a necessity in order to generate revenue, the need to incorporate the development of visa technology, but ensuring that there's still a chance to make some money out of it, is short-sighted and dated policies that are no longer fit for purpose. And ultimately, the message has to convey that there's a much greater chance for revenue generation if we're able to open up the markets for free movement. But I'm afraid that I don't believe that there is a genuine future in the short to medium term for anything that resembles an African passport until such time as we're able to move beyond the short-sighted approach that we're currently having to deal with. And to be fair, even in the European Union, whilst they all have what they call EU passports, they are still issued on a national basis, and there are still certain limitations and restrictions that are applied. But my honest opinion is that I see it currently as a non-starter.
In fact, I would mention that the notion, what is the big deal about wanting to have an African passport? This is just nonsensical. You don't need to have the same document looking the same way to allow people to enter. You need policies at the national level that say, yeah, we want you, come in. You don't need a piece of thing, whether it's plastic or paper was, but that's irrelevant. So, but I, given the last 15 years, I've been working across African governments in the trade front and investment front. I don't think I will see in my living lifetime an African passport. I'm sorry. That's a wasted energy. What makes sense is to get rid of the barriers, the visa requirements and all those things. The Kenyan case is a classic. I have 2 passports. One is Canadian and one is Trinidad and Tobago. On the TNT passport, I never needed a visa to enter Kenya. Since they introduced what is called a, whatever it's called, I forgot.
Electronic travel authorization.
An electronic authorization. It now costs single entry, $34. Single entry. My Canadian country has an ETA that costs $7 Canadian, which is about $6 US, and it's good for 5 years. And it's multiple entry. So the Kenyan thing is a bit of a ruse and was designed as a revenue grab. Now let's call a spade, okay? So African governments have to get serious about what they're doing, and they have to put their money where their mouth is. And the Kenyan thing to me was the most embarrassing on this front. Mind you, they've had to walk back for the ECOWAS countries. I heard 9 countries it has been removed, the fee, etc., etc. So it's, this is, you have to be doing things in good faith, not pretending. And I agree that the African Union as a forum is really just a talk shop, and you don't really see the tangible actions that should come from these things. I mean, we're talking about, Gilbert is talking about something that was signed in 1989, single African airspace and all this good stuff. 1989, folks.
36 years ago.
Okay. How many technological changes and how many things didn't exist that we take for granted now 36 years ago? So I'm not, I'm not impressed. What I would suggest to the industry, though, is that not enough of you belong to your organizations. For example, in Kenya, the Hotel and Innkeepers Association has less than 20% of the membership. I don't know how much better it is in South Africa or Botswana for comparison, but too many African tourism operators do not belong to the associations. And as a result, I think they don't have enough weight. They don't have enough political weight in terms of influencing policymakers. Now, the big guys, they can call the minister, but the associations need to have a lot more representation from the sector. And I don't know why this is not the case. And that's something that you have to ask yourself as associations, but also as operators. Why don't I join the group? Is it fees? Is it what? I don't know. But where tourism works, like Mauritius, etc., the operators belong to the associations. So I think there's a point to be made, some kind of story to be investigated there. So I have to applaud AESATA, and I must confess I never heard of you until 2 months ago. All right, so there you go.
Great, we are here now. So you'll hear more of us. Gilbert, your closing remarks.
The African passport is an Agenda 2063 item. I agree with Ramesh's comments that we really don't need the African passport, but it was meant to be for a good purpose, for Africa recognition around Africa by Africans. But you really don't need that, and I agree with Ramesh, because all you need is a visa-free regime. You can come in with your own passport. So you don't really need an African passport. But let me tell you where the free movement of person and Africa passport greatest impediment lies. It's not in a visa-free regime. It is in what that Africa passport will allow you to do in Africa. So when you read the Agenda 2063, what it allows you to do with the African passport, you can live and work in any country in Africa. Okay? So you can go and get a Kenyan can go and get a job in South Africa. A South African can go and get a job in Nigeria. So there's you will have the freedom to live and work wherever you choose in Africa. Now, that is the biggest problem. Some African countries are saying there will be an influx of immigrants which we don't want. Other African states will say there is an outflow of our people that we don't want. There'll be brain drain. So there is the biggest problem. Allowing Africans to work anywhere in Africa. It's not even about visa. So my closing statement is, let's come up with a visa-free regime in all of Africa. And then implement SAATM, and then AFCFTA will become a reality. Tourism will be huge, like you wouldn't believe. 1.4 billion Africans. Imagine if 10% of them decide they want to travel. That's 140 million Africans. Forget the 11 million that we're talking about now. Imagine if your market is 140 million people. What does that mean for you travel agents, you tour operators, you airlines, you hotels? We are going to grow Africa ourselves. There will be a Pan-African growth ourselves, and we will have terms and conditions for how we will operate with outsiders for our benefit. So wherever we are, in whatever way that we can influence African governments to implement SAATM and implement a visa-free regime, the private sector will build Africa among Africans. Thank you.
Well said.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think 1 hour is not enough for this discussion. I think we needed a little bit more time. I've enjoyed every single conversation you've had, and it's really, really been eye-opening, even for me. And I think we want to continue this conversation as AESATA. As I said, we also are newly formed. We are trying to create our agenda as a region, and that's why I want to take this opportunity. We want to have this conversation and continue with it, and to invite all of you, if you can, please join us for our second AESATA Travel Agents Conference in Kigali. We are talking about beyond borders, beyond limits. Let's begin to see the opportunities we have, traveling across Africa, but also how do we begin to trade amongst ourselves across the continent. So I think if you are interested in this, we'll be able to share the details. You can reach out to us, and my colleague will be able to give you the details. So thank you very much all. I think it's been a great discussion, and we'll continue this discussion going forward. And particularly if you can, please join us in Kigali, where we will talk more about how do we enable intra-Africa trade as we look beyond our borders, and of course the limits that we have created for ourselves in terms of growing our business. Thank you very much, Ramesh. Thank you very much, Gilbert. Thank you very much, Otto. I think you've done justice to this conversation, and I hope that we can continue with this conversation beyond today. I really appreciate you for giving your time. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. Have a
Thank
great
you.
weekend.
Take care.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.